Hello and welcome to Through the Inquisitor's Lens, the podcast that explores the complex world of public inquiries and inquests, one question at a time. I'm Anna Centre and I'm a Principal Associate in our Inquiries and Investigations team. In today's episode, Navigating Public Hearings, Best Practices in Media Engagement, I'm delighted to be joined by John Clements of Crest Advisory. John is one of the Executive Directors at Crest Advisory. Before joining Crest, he was a broadcaster for ITN and a reporter for the Daily Mirror. He specialised in home affairs and crimes, reporting and commentating on major events, including the 2011 riots and a number of public inquiries, including the inquest into the July 7 bombings. Crest has a dedicated inquiries practice with a team of experts who provide chairs, secretaries and legal teams with supports that cover all stages of an inquiry, including public hearings, which is a topic that we're going to be discussing today. Before we delve into the topic of public hearings, perhaps I could ask you, John, to tell us a little bit more about the work you do at Crest and some of your experiences. And welcome. Thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for that introduction. So it's actually about 10 years ago now, 10 years ago this month, May, that Crest began working for public inquiries. And since then we've worked for around a dozen statutory and non-statutory inquiries, and particularly sort of looking at communications and sometimes policy focus, but also generally trying to sort of help inquiries bring the outside in and remind themselves about some of the outside world and make sure that they support their work internally with good communications externally, making sure people understand why the inquiry has been set up, what it's doing, how it's operating, and generally trying to bring a sort of an emphasis on the non-legal side of an inquiry to sort of maximise trust and confidence in that process to help ensure that when an inquiry publishes its reports and makes its recommendations, they have the best possible chance of landing well, of gaining support and of leading to the change for which ultimately a minister has set a public inquiry up to achieve. Thank you very much for having us here.
Great, and 10 years, I'm sure you've seen a dramatic change in the landscape of public inquiries. I think they're a really powerful tool today in our democracy that ensure that lessons are learned from events of significant public concern. At the moment, we've got around 20 open or announced public inquiries. And I think a well-conducted public inquiry helps restore that trust to ensure that past mistakes, that lessons are learned rather than become repeated failure. And I think a successful inquiry at the core of that is, I think, independence, transparency, and importantly, public access to information so that the public has that trust and confidence that accountability measures are taking place. And public hearings are a key element of that transparency and enhancing that access or public access to information. Can I start by asking you, John, from your experience, what does a good public hearing or public inquiry hearing look like?
Gosh, firstly, you're absolutely right. It's really important for public inquiries that they show and don't just tell the public what's going on. An inquiry's been set up because something has gone seriously wrong, and there's a sense in government that the normal mechanisms for finding out what went wrong don't work. So there's a degree of scepticism already built into the start of an inquiry in terms of the people most affected, the public as well, who are going to be interested in this, that they may not necessarily believe everything they're being told. There's a sense that the authorities have let them down and the truth hasn't come out. So it's really important for public inquiries to show, don't just tell what you're doing, and the public hearing is part of that. It's putting a face to the public inquiry. It's where a chair or a panel who are inevitably authority figures will have the best possible chance and moment to show that they are actually fully paid up members of the human race, that they genuinely do want to get to the truth, that they are there asking the questions of witnesses that people want asked. So it really is the kind of shop window, and it's a really important moment for an inquiry where they can do that process of showing, not just telling. They stop becoming a perhaps slightly remote, hidden away organisation that's been not particularly visible from perhaps the opening statement for thereafter for kind of many months. So the hearings, they need to be as open as you possibly can. They need to show the inquiry for what it is. They need to lift the lid on the workings and really demonstrate that truth-seeking, evidence-gathering process. So to do that, obviously, requires a lot of preparation and organisation. And obviously, legal teams will be doing all of their work, preparing for the hearings, evidence, disclosure, and all of that work that goes on behind the scenes. And that's absolutely necessary, but we would argue that that's not necessarily sufficient to have a successful public hearing. You really need to think through, how is this inquiry going to look and feel to people who want to engage with it, whether that's called participants or witnesses or the general public, also media, MPs, stakeholders, the industry that may well be relied upon to implement your recommendations. They also are a really important audience for all of that hearing. So thinking through the audiences for your hearing and working out how you can put your best foot forward all the way down to those final details, because there's probably quite a few examples we can think of public hearings that have gone wrong, mishaps, missteps, because you will have the media there, because you will be probably live streamed. Any small mishap like that becomes a communications problem. It generates unnecessary commentary and distraction. So part of our role, we always think at Crest, is to help think through a lot of the what-ifs around hearings, to think through what could be a distraction, what could be a disruption, what could be a problem, and take all of those things out of the equation so that chair, counsel can get on with examining witnesses, asking the questions, listening to the answers, and keeping up to speed and progress. We're never in the business of trying to, drum up publicity for a public inquiry. It's not about PR. It's not about getting good headlines necessarily. It's about removing and minimising the noise that can distract an inquiry from getting on with its business of fulfilling its terms of reference.
Thank you. I think that's really important and allows the inquiry to focus on what's really important and at the heart of the matter, and linked to that, one of the benefits of public inquiries is that it gives those who have been affected by the event a voice and an opportunity to be heard. And what we're seeing more and more recently is these commemorative hearings or pen portraits, where there's an opportunity to hear directly from those who have been impacted by the events. I mean, I've been in some of the hearings and heard some of that evidence, and gosh, it's powerful, and I think an excellent way to remind everyone at the start of the inquiry why we're there and how important the work is. What's your experience of these commemorative hearings, and what do you think are the successful ingredients or things to think about?
Gosh, good question. I mean, on a personal level, I've sat through a number of commemorative hearings. We've supported 3 or 4 now, going all the way back to the Grenfell Tower commemorations, which were the first commemorative hearings to be effectively done on camera. Obviously, inquests had done pen portraits before, but those are not those aren't live streamed. So they're very impactful. I think they're also they're really important, clearly, to the bereaved, to the affected, to those impacted. But I think they also become very important to the inquiry, because again, they provide a really good opportunity for the inquiry to absolutely show to the people most affected that this inquiry can be a vehicle to help them get some of what they need, whether that's answers, whether that's a voice, whether that's a sense of being meaningfully included in this process, that it's not being done to them, that they have an impact on it. I think it's a really good opportunity often for the inquiry team to build trust and confidence on a personal level with the bereaved, with CPs who they may well be carrying their kind of hopes and concerns for many years on a long-running inquiry, and it is an opportunity to build some personal relationships, and that trust and confidence can potentially be very useful further down the line. If people know that you have done right by them and their memory of their loved one through that commemorative process, that you've helped them say what they wanted to say or show the world what they wanted to show, I think that counts for a lot. So success factors, I think really listening to what I'll call them bereaved. There's a shorthand for the purposes of this process. What the bereaved want is really important, because you can't treat the bereaved as one single group. I know obviously lawyers who worked in civil and criminal practice will know this all the time. They obviously have deal with people who are vulnerable or traumatised, who suffered a great loss, but opinions will differ, and I think it's very much about the inquiry making an offer and then listening and hearing back what that offer may be. In my experience, not all families necessarily want to do a commemorative tribute or participate at the start. Some of them may change their minds when they see what that looks like for others. I think it's really important inquiries build some flexibility into that. I totally understand that there is always the need to make progress, and there's a tension between keeping to pace, the logistics around access to venues, around making sure that the inquiry does deliver the terms of reference in a reasonable time frame. But I would always encourage an inquiry to consider, can you build a little bit of slack in? Can you, what if a family says on the day before commemorative hearings are scheduled to finish, actually I've changed my mind, we'd really like to do one. Yeah. Are you really going to say to them, I'm really sorry you've missed the boat? Or actually in reality, are you going to try to accommodate them if you possibly can? So thinking through how you can do that, I think is really important. So making an offer, listening and adapting to the views of the people who are carrying the greatest burden, I think is really important. I think there are some practical things as well around really setting expectations as well around what you can and can't do, and looking after your own team and staff. I think sort of 20-30 years ago, perhaps lots of professions, my previous career as a journalist, probably had very different views about the secondary trauma and what staff are exposed to, and I'm sure that probably the legal profession's probably on a similar journey. But I think making sure that your team are looked after as well, I think is quite important. It's something certainly we do at Crest. We have quite a trauma-informed approach. You never know what is going on in your own staff's lives that may be triggered or reawakened through stuff they hear. We've certainly had that on occasions where the issues at hand and something someone said has really impacted a member of our team, so you have to have processes in place to make sure they're supported. Because again, it's in the best interest of the inquiry that you have a kind of a resilient team that are able to get on with the work, and don't find themselves overwhelmed by some really, very, very difficult material. I would always advise an inquiry, almost at the outset these days, to get in a bit of a view from a psychologist about what's going to come up here. How is your team going to potentially react? What do you need to look out for? How are some of your core participants? What may they be experiencing? I think a trauma-informed approach to communications is critical. I really, if there's one thing I would say to an inquiry looking at commemorative hearings, you must have a trauma-informed approach, not just how you're delivering them, but also all your communications around it. Because people who are suffering from trauma and may have a lot of other needs in their lives at that point, they may not interpret information the way that perhaps you or I would. And thinking through how you communicate difficult news, such as you will only have 20 minutes to give your pen portrait.
Yeah.
It's very easy to be very practical about that, but that might feel like an immediate loss of control.
Yeah.
And actually, you may need to really think through how do we explain to people why we're doing what we're doing, what the rationale is. And with the best will in the world, the people who work on inquiries, are, they're lawyers or they're policy officials or they're organisers, and that's not our primary skill set. And so I think everyone has to probably go on a little bit of a journey to just think through what does that look like, how might we need to adapt a little bit and realise that what passes as, comms person to journalist communications or lawyer to lawyer communications simply may not work for some of your audiences there.
Yeah, I think I couldn't agree more, and it's really interesting that you speak about that, because the science behind all of it is fascinating, and so important that we understand the science behind it so that we're able to make the right decisions. And I think it's really interesting what you say about having that psychologist input at the start so that we can truly understand how it works. So reflecting back on the 10 years that Crest has been working for public inquiries and supporting them, I've been in this line of work for 10 years as well, and gosh, I've seen a huge shift in how public inquiries public inquiry hearings are conducted, and probably the obvious catapult for that was the COVID pandemic. You spoke about Grenfell Tower inquiry, and of course that inquiry was in the throes of hearing evidence when the pandemic hit, and it had to shift very quickly, and I think very successfully, to a hybrid way of operating. Well, at first a purely virtual way of operating, with hearings being held online. And now I think all inquiry hearings are hybrid models, with people in the room but also people able to follow online. I think it's been a really positive development. It gives that broader access to the hearings and enhances that crucial element of transparency. In your experience, is the hybrid model, is that successful? Are they here to stay?
Yes, I think so. I think there's very good reasons. There's a number of good reasons for why I think it works and it's a good model. Firstly, just reflecting back on, we were just talking previously about traumatised individuals and how people who are suffering from trauma, one of the things they really experience is a loss of control. And one of the best ways that you can engage people, I'm told, I'm not an expert, is to offer choice. We can do this, we can do that, we can do this. What would you prefer? And actually saying to people, you don't need to come to the hearing, you don't need to travel, you can follow it online, is immediately giving people some options and some choice. Whereas 15, 20 years ago, people would have to attend in person, and there's obviously issues. There can be issues around hardship and cost of living, and some people might not be able to attend in person, or they may not be able physically. There may be lots of barriers. So I think the hybrid option there works well. I think a number of inquiries have historically struggled to find venues, and part of that is the size of the hearing room. I think certainly the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse struggled to find a venue for a lot of reasons in the early days, and finally did. But Grenfell Tower inquiry, when we were there, went through, we had opening statement at one venue, we had phase 1 hearings at another venue, and then finally phase 2 was at the hearings that the COVID inquiry are now at. Now that's a very big hearing room. It's built for to accommodate dozens and dozens and dozens of lawyers, plus a large public, plus media. And I think potentially do all legal teams need to be in the hearing room all the time? Probably not. Journalists, I don't think they do now. My experience is most journalists would much rather follow it online, unless there is a particular witness. I do think you always need to recognise that there are some witnesses who, let's say politicians or celebrities, who people will inevitably want to see in the flesh, and you can't quite lose sight of that. And that may also be quite important for CPs and the bereaved, who absolutely will want to sit there and, as they would perhaps see it, look that person in the eye as they give evidence. And I think across all inquiries we can think of the high-profile witnesses, whether they're cabinet ministers or famous people, or to quote the sort of the villain of the piece, perhaps a high-profile civil servant or business executive. And I think you'll always need to balance that. I'd always be worried about an inquiry saying, we can shut everybody out, we're just going to cut costs and go hybrid. I think that might be that would cross over that line about not necessarily being public. And I think the public, it's a bit like church, isn't it? People don't go to church, but they like the idea that they could if they wanted to. And
absolutely.
I think it's a bit like a public inquiry or even a court. Very few people actually go to the public gallery, but I think people would be outraged if you said they couldn't.
No, it's a good point. And linked to that point, of course, under Section 18 of the Inquiries Act, it mandates that the inquiry proceedings should be held in public, that the chair has to take reasonable steps to enable members of the public either to attend or to have access to a live transmission of the hearings. But the Act also allows for restrictions on public access when there's issues of national security, sensitive personal information or classified information, and some hearings are held in behind closed doors in private, so closed hearings, certainly statutory inquiries and of course non-statutory inquiries as well. It's difficult, I think, to balance the need for restrictions on some evidence that simply cannot be heard in public with the requirements for transparency, and that the inquiry is not seen to be closing the door on public access. Do you have any thoughts around how you achieve that or approach that delicate balance, and also the practicalities of closed hearings? I remember, when one of the closed hearings I did, we had to ensure that there was back access to the building so that the witness could arrive without, the press or members of the public seeing. There's a lot of things to consider with closed hearings, isn't there?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the first thing is your last point, which is if a hearing's closed, it's actually got to be properly closed. There can be nothing that's probably more damaging to the credibility of an inquiry than a closed hearing which accidentally becomes not closed. It could be very dangerous to the witness, and so forth. So there's that big bucket of work around the practicalities. Drawing on some of the closed hearings that we've supported, we did the communications for the Manchester Arena inquiry, and obviously there were closed hearings there. And I think there's a lot of useful learning from that inquiry. I think the public it goes back again to sort of show, don't tell. So if you can show the public why the inquiry has to have closed hearings and explain the rationale, perhaps explain it more than you might think you need to, but there's no harm in over communicating things sometimes. And I think if you can show the rationale for it, I think the public are probably more willing to accept that than perhaps you might think, given general levels of scepticism around authority. I think a lot of it depends on how has the inquiry presented itself up until that point. So if people can feel and see that the inquiry has been as open as it possibly could be up to that point, it's been willing to accommodate, and it's got the trust and confidence of CPs, but it just has this issue here where it's going to have to do closed hearings. I think that goes a long way to getting a fair audience for the rationale for why the hearings have to be closed. I think there are things that you can do after closed hearings. I think the Manchester Arena inquiry did a very good job. I would say that, wouldn't I? But I think they did, and we can't take the credit for that. That was absolutely led by the chair and his team. But the decision to publish a gist of the evidence, I think, was really, really important. And I think if you look at the reaction of the families to that and to the final reports. Speaking broadly, I don't think they welcomed the closed hearings, but I think they accepted that the process was fair and had been properly run, and that the inquiry had done a pretty good job of explaining to them before, why, and after what the gist of the evidence was.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably one of the key learnings. We have done some polling, by the way, of what the public thinks about public inquiries. And one of the questions that came up was about closed hearings.
Interesting.
And it's available on our website if anyone wants to look at it. But the main learning there was that definitely people would be more confident in the inquiry. I think it was a clear majority of the public were more confident in an inquiry that held closed hearings if the chair was able to explain a bit about the process that had been gone through during the closed hearings. For example, how long did the hearings last?
Yeah.
And then provide a gist of the evidence, and really explain the rationale for it. Just because people don't like a decision doesn't mean they won't accept it.
Yeah.
And I think inquiries have lots of tricky decisions, but sometimes about who's the CP and who isn't, which witnesses are going to be called and which aren't. And closed hearings was one of those tricky issues. And it does mean you can potentially lose some of that public element.
Yeah.
But if you've done as much as you can as your business in public and been really open about it and shown willing where you can, I think that helps a lot.
And that takes time, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Build that trust and confidence, and having that ongoing dialogue, and building that relationship with your stakeholders.
It absolutely does. We sort of have a saying: every touch point with an inquiry is a chance to build trust and confidence with a potentially sceptical audience. And so it's a whole team effort. It's everything from the chair to the security staff to the ushers. If every single person there understands that they have a duty to make the inquiry as public as possible, that goes such a long way. Yeah. And it's the small touches, I think, that often will count a lot.
And thinking about that requirements to make it as public as possible, there's that further requirement under Section 18 that the public can have access to the evidence that's been heard by the inquiry and the documents, and that's usually achieved through a website, live transcription. AI is something that's talked about often these days, and I think in some inquiries they're exploring the AI transcription service. Have you had any experience of how AI might impact on public inquiries?
Gosh, I
hope we'll still have a job, so I think we will.
That's a huge question. That's a whole podcast in itself,
isn't it?
and one I would much rather listen to than speak to, because I'd like to learn about it, and I'm not an expert on it. I think there's two things. Firstly, I'm old enough to remember when, say, the de Menezes inquest, we used Live Note on its live link, which was almost a kind of instantaneous transcription into subtitles, and that was nearly 20 years ago, and journalists loved it. It was really helpful. It would obviously throw up some slightly strange, comical, transcriptions of things, but it was really useful. I don't understand why we're not able to provide proper transcripts. I think it's baffling, and I think journalists find it baffling, and I think probably MPs and anybody else, and these are audiences who are potentially quite important, find it strange that the transcript can't be uploaded to the end of the day, and when it comes out it's divided into 4 and it's covered in strange numbers, and I know lawyers understand that transcript but nobody else does. And I think it should be pretty straightforward, I think, to provide a transcript which is live and updated, or at least in a format that is searchable. The number of times journalists will say, it's in a PDF, we can't, it's really hard to search, we're trying to report accurately here, we're up against, there are almost no deadlines now in news, it's 24 hours a day. And I think that would be an easy win for an inquiry. And again, it just shows willing.
Yeah,
if you're an inquiry that has closed hearings, but you say, look, we're going to give you a live transcript of everything up to that point. We really want we want to make it easier for you, the public, to see our work, to follow our work, to scrutinise it, to check that we're that we are doing what we said we do in public. I think it's an easy decision. I'll leave the technology to someone else, but I just don't believe it's not doable.
And it's all about putting a face to the work that we do and show, just tell. It feeds into that whole point, doesn't it? And I think ultimately the success of an inquiry depends on political will to act on the findings and recommendations, public engagement with that inquiry and that buy-in to the work, and also media scrutiny. And I know it's not a PR exercise, but I do think that the media has an important role to play in the success of a public inquiry. Are there any tips or recommendations that you could offer in terms of how you successfully involve a media team in public inquiries?
Sure.
And hearings specifically.
I mean, some of this would apply to almost anything, any kind of event, let's say, where the media are present, which is, you need to facilitate their needs within some clear boundaries that they understand and you understand. And in my experience, the best reporters, the most professional journalists, they just want to know what the boundaries are. And once they understand them, that's fine, and they will then get on with their job. So that's obviously things like space, information about what's coming up, all those kind of basics. And pretty much, I think, once an inquiry gets to hearings, that's what media want. They want the evidence, and they are there to report that accurately, and by and large they want to get their stories right. I think there's an interesting kind of development where you're seeing kind of a lot of the public kind of turning away from what we'd call mainstream media, and you're getting this kind of rise in conspiracy theories and unregulated fake news, for want of a better phrase. And I actually think that potentially, more than ever, inquiries should view news media as a critical friend, because news media want to report the facts accurately. They themselves suffer from often the effects of disinformation, misinformation, fake news. They want to get things right, and I think it's really important that inquiries kind of embrace that and do what they can to work constructively with journalists. I kind of think it's almost a no-brainer these days that you should welcome them in. You're completely right that public inquiries start and end with politics. It's a political decision to set one up, and it's a political decision about what to do with the recommendations. And the inquiry, having had its work accurately, consistently, and well reported, will help that process. Ministers, officials, policy advisors, they may not have time to sit there watching the inquiry every day. They will be relying probably on what they read on the news as much as official briefings potentially. So winning over good, accurate, balanced coverage can only be in the inquiry's interest. And by and large, I think they do achieve that. I think there's definitely merit in recognising that potential alliance, I think, or a shared goal, let's say, between a lot of the news media that covers inquiries and inquiry teams.
Lovely. Thank you, John. I'm very grateful to you for your time.
Thank you.
It's been
Fascinating
really interesting.
Discussion.
Yeah, really interesting, and thank you for being so generous with the time. And I think there are some excellent takeaways from today's session that I hope our listeners will have enjoyed. Thank you very much. If you'd like to learn more about Crest Advisory and the work that they do, please head over to their website, www.crestadvisory.com, and do get in touch with a member of their team. Thank you for listening today. We hope you enjoyed.